So you hear this all the time, right? A country is developing or it's a success story. But what does that actually mean? Is it just about the money or is there something more going on? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into. We're going to look at the powerful and sometimes kind of surprising ways we figure this stuff out.
All right, so to really get our heads around this, let's look at a case study. And it's a big one. We're talking about one of the most incredible economic turnarounds in recent memory, Vietnam.
Just look at this. This scene right here, it's buzzing with energy, right? It's the perfect snapshot of modern Vietnam, and believe me, it is a world away from where the country was just a few decades back. This image really captures the end result of this incredible change. But the real question is, how do we measure the journey it took to get here? I mean, look at these numbers. They're just staggering. Seriously. Back in 1986, Vietnam was one of the poorest places on the planet. Your average person was making just $100 a year. Inflation was through the roof, over 700%, and the whole economy was centrally planned. Now, fast forward to today. The income per person, once you adjust for what that money can actually buy, it's over $13,000. Exports, they've exploded to $340 billion. The whole economy has flipped from state-controlled to market-oriented. That's not a step, that is a colossal leap. Okay, so this brings us right back to that main question. When you see a change this huge, this dramatic, what's the right way to measure it? What are the tools we use to really get a handle on the scale of a journey like this? And, importantly, how do we use those tools to compare Vietnam's story with what's happening in other countries? Okay, so the most common place to start, the number you always hear about on the news, is a country's total economic output. And that metric, of course, is gross domestic product. You know it as GDP. The easiest way to think about it is like this. Imagine you took everything a country produces in 1 year, every car, every coffee, every piece of software, and put a price tag on it. You add all that up and boom, that's the GDP. It gives you a single raw number for the size of that economy. And to make it easier to compare, say, China and Luxembourg, we usually just divide it by the number of people to get the GDP per capita. So when we paint the world using this GDP number, this is the map you get. And it probably looks pretty familiar, right? You've got the reds and oranges showing countries with higher GDP per person, and the greens and blues for the lower levels. It gives you this very clear but maybe incomplete picture of the world's rich and poor countries. But here's the catch. We all know this from our own lives, right? A dollar in New York City doesn't buy you the same thing as a dollar in, say, Omaha. Well, the exact same thing is true for countries. So that big, flashy GDP number, it doesn't really tell the whole story. Which leads to a way more interesting question. What can a dollar actually buy? What does that income really mean for someone's day-to-day life? What's their real standard of living? Well, to get closer to that answer, economists have this really clever tool. It's called purchasing power parity, or PPP for short. Basically, what it does is it takes that GDP number and adjusts it for the cost of living. It's all about leveling the playing field so we can get a much better comparison of what people's money can actually buy them. And this is where it gets really interesting. Look at this side by side. On the left, you've got that standard GDP map we saw before. But on the right, that's the world adjusted for PPP. Just look at the difference. See how countries like China and India suddenly pop? They get a much darker shade of orange. And that tells us that even though their headline GDP might be lower, the cost of living there is also way lower. So people's money goes a whole lot further than you'd think just by looking at the first map. Okay, so we have a much smarter way to measure wealth now. But this brings up an even bigger question, doesn't it? Is money everything? Does all that wealth actually equal success or, well-being for the people living there? This is where the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen comes in. He really challenged this whole idea. He argued that we need to think way bigger. For him, real development isn't just about how much money people have, it's about expanding their real freedoms. Yeah, freedom from poverty is part of it for sure, but it's also about the freedom to get an education, the freedom to have good healthcare, the freedom to actually be a part of your society. And you know what? These weren't just some abstract academic ideas. They directly inspired a whole new way to measure a country's progress, one that tries to give us a much more complete picture of human life. It's called the Human Development Index, or HDI, and it was developed by the United Nations. It's a direct attempt to take Sen's philosophy and turn it into a practical tool. It tries to measure what really matters for a person's quality of life, not just the cash they have. So how's it work? Well, the HDI is built on three main pillars. First, can people live a long and healthy life? That's measured by life expectancy. Second, do they have access to knowledge? That looks at education. And third, do they have a decent standard of living? And yeah, that's where income comes back in. By combining all three, you get a much, much richer picture of what development actually looks like on the ground.
Okay, so this is the crucial part. What happens when we take this whole new toolkit, not just GDP, but PPP and this bigger idea of human development, and we bring it all the way back to our story about Vietnam?
While you start to see a much more complicated, more nuanced picture. On the one hand, you have this undeniable economic miracle. I mean, the growth is incredible, the exports are booming, it's a powerhouse. But on the other hand, there are still some pretty big challenges. Things like corruption, inefficient state-owned companies, and a political system that limits certain freedoms. And those are things that just don't show up in a GDP number, but they absolutely impact that knowledge and well-being part of the story. And that leaves us right back where we started, but with a whole new way of looking at it. What is the true measure of a nation's success? Is it just its wealth? Or is it the freedom and the well-being of its people? It really makes you think, doesn't it? The next time you see one of those headlines about the global economy, you'll know the real story often depends entirely on which lens you choose to look through.